Hi everyone, and welcome to today's GP Strategies webinar. I'm Margaret Bishop, Core Consultant in Strategy, Leadership and Culture, and I'll be your host for today's event. If you have joined us before, welcome back. And if it's your first time with us, thanks for joining. We do have a great session planned today with Professor Peter Hawkins, who'll be sharing his insights on beyond authentic leadership. Okay, so we're going to get started. So I will introduce you to Peter, Professor Peter Hawkins. Many of you will know him already as a colleague and as a leader in the field of consulting, working internationally with top companies on major change projects and coaching top teams. He is also, of course, Professor at Henley Business School, President of the Academy of Executive Coaching, thought leader and author. And his most recent book, Leadership Team Coaching in Practice, is another indispensable resource for all of you team coaches. So Peter, it is a pleasure as always to have you here with us today. And now I'd like to turn the session over to you.
Thank you, Margaret, and welcome everyone. Very good to see many friends and colleagues have joined us today from various parts of the world. For this, the fourth in the series that I've been doing as part of the GP Strategies webinars. And I just want to give you a quick recap of where we've been, but you are very welcome to go back and listen to some of the earlier sessions. So welcome, and we started this series by looking at this very important formula, how organizations need to learn faster than their environment is changing. The one thing that we know is that the environment that we all inhabit is changing faster and in more complex ways than ever before. Not only the social and political environment, but the ecological environment and the whole business ecosystem in which our organizations operate. And I started the series very much focusing on the need for 21st century businesses to be purpose-driven, to focus on what they can uniquely do that the world of tomorrow needs, and how that purpose is very different from the 20th century idea of missions, where it's a bold affirmation of the reason for being, the raison d'etre of organizations. And it conveys what the organization stands for and who it serves and the difference it's there to make in the world. I talked about some of the benefits of having a very powerful galvanizing purpose, how it creates collective shared meaning, how it attracts and energizes employees in the war for talent, how it can be a real differentiator, how it aligns the organization and gives it a sense of collaborative, joint, shared purpose, creates passion, how it links culture, leadership, and strategy together. And that's what we went on to look at, was particularly in the second webinar, was how if the world is changing faster and in more complex ways, strategizing has to be a weekly, monthly, regular drumbeat of change. But as Peter Drucker said, culture will always eat our strategy for breakfast. And if it's far easier to shift our strategy than to change our culture. And we then went on to look at how to shift the culture, you have to shift the leadership culture, not just the leaders, but the spaces between leaders, the collective leadership culture of the organization, to deliver the shift in culture, to deliver the strategy, to fulfill the purpose. And how in so many organizations, one calls in a McKinsey or a Baines to help you with the strategy, the OD department help with culture, leadership development you might do with a business school, and we don't deal with how do we get these three aligned and all joined up. We then went on to look at how we have to understand culture at many levels, not just the artifacts and the statements about the culture and the logos and the branding, but the patterns of behavior and how those patterns of behavior are driven by some of the collective assumptions and mindsets, by the emotional ground of the organization and by the motivational roots, the sense of what gives people a sense of why they come to work in the morning. And we looked at, in the third seminar, how organizational learning needs to be a process that connects all of those. The organizational learning is not just about lots of individuals in the organization all learning and developing, but the organization itself learning and evolving in response to its ecosystem. We talked about the need to learn faster for everyone, individuals, teams, functions, organizations, and how we're seeing a much faster turnover in the organizational life cycle of organizations. And most of that is because the organizations fail to learn and adapt to the new environmental needs and demands. One only has to look at organizations like Kodak or Olivetti, who were brilliant in their field, but failed to adapt to the changing context in which they were operating. We explained 7 key learning processes, and do go back and listen to that webinar, how we can enable learning at individual, strategy level, team of teams level, interfunctional, and how we can learn with our stakeholders, not just internally within the organization. And this brings us on very much to the subject of today's talk, which is how do we create leaders who are learners and leaders who are enablers and disruptors of learning in themselves, others, teams, organizations, and in the wider business and social ecosystem. How do we have leaders really step up to be enablers of learning throughout the whole organization? And this, to set it in the context of our times, we have many, many challenges, but at heart, there is only one major challenge, which is that the more than human world, the environment we all share, is desperately trying to tell the human world that it needs to wake up, to listen, learn, and change. But clearly the evidence shows that the human world is stuck in willful blindness and doesn't want to wake up, to listen, to learn, or change in relation to what's happening in our shared environment. And we really need to think about how do we develop the future fit leadership that the world requires. And there on the right, some of you may recognize is, I think, a new leader model of our time, Greta Thunberg, who at 15 decided the world was in such a state that she should no longer go to school, but go and stand by herself as a 15-year-old girl who was suffering from autism outside the Swedish government. And in 1 year, she had followers in 60 or 70 countries around the world. She had a mass movement of thousands, and she was addressing Davos, the European Parliament, the British Cabinet. This is extraordinary. And what made her a great leader? It was nothing to do with her education or her wisdom. It was the clarity of purpose that she brought, and the clarity of the galvanizing challenge she brought to our times. So today, we're going to look at what is the sort of leadership that's needed for not only our time now, but for the future, for Greta Thunberg's generation. And what's our part in helping to develop that? And I'm going to be linking that to why I believe that means we have to move beyond a lot of the common notions about authentic leadership. But let's just say a little bit about the history of authentic leadership. Bill George was one of the first kind of key writers in this area, and he said, due to the current crisis, complexity, and challenge facing our society and organizations, we need a new type of leadership, the authentic leader. And notice the singular. Goffey and Jones in the UK wrote about leadership demands the expression of an authentic self. Ibarra in 2015, authenticity has become the gold standard for leaders. Carter, even earlier, saying authenticity is defined as knowing oneself and acting accordingly. And Aviola, authentic leaders are deeply aware of how they think and behave and are perceived by others as being aware of their own and others' values, moral perspectives, knowledge and strengths, aware of the context in which they operate, and who are confident, hopeful, optimistic, resilient, and of high moral character. I think what we've done is we've created a new version of the 20th century heroic leader, one which is meant to have even higher capacities and abilities and higher standards than ever before. And we've created a heroic archetype which is impossible to live up to. I've written a paper, and if you email me, I'm happy to send it to you. It's not yet published, called Beyond the Authentic Leader. And in it, I point out a number of the paradoxes that I and others have written about. That the first is, we suggest that leaders need to be both authentic, but also, as Abiola said in that last quote, confident, hopeful, optimistic, resilient, and high moral character. But now we've got a paradox. What happens when you're not feeling confident or hopeful? Do you pretend and therefore become inauthentic? Yes? Or are you authentically not hopeful or confident when your people need to see your confidence? There we have a paradox. Then we have a contextual paradox. Somebody once said, you could tell a leader because they treat everyone the same, but somebody else said, you could tell a real wise leader because they treat everyone differently, because they can be true to themselves, but choose which part of them is most needed for this place, this moment, in this time. We have the identity paradox. Gurdjieff, who was a great 20th century spiritual teacher, said, the I that goes to bed at night saying they're going to get up early in the morning and get work done is not the same I that wakes up in the morning. We all have multiple selves. I had a great colleague who used to suddenly go into kind of moral injunctions to some of their consultancy clients. And I said, look, you're there to work with a client, not bring in your own kind of moral objectives. He said, oh, but I've got to be true to who I am. And I said to him, so who is this I that's being true to you? Is that a different I? If you think about it, it's a strange concept. We have multiple selves through our lives and through our different contexts. We are a community of selves. The fourth paradox is the depth paradox. In a hyper-change world, a leader must be able to style flex, high flex in a high flux world. Rigidity is the enemy of good leadership. Flexibility its ally. This is Genovese, who's a professor, Michael Genovese, of public sector leadership in America. That notice, that realization that the world when Margaret Thatcher said the lady is not for turning, and her raison d'etre was sticking to her guns come what may. Think of that term, sticking to your guns. This is a 20th century concept. We need a high flex leadership for a high flux world. And then the fifth paradox. The more we've talked about authentic leadership in the last 20 years, the Edelman Trust Barometer, and do go and look it up on the Google, and how much people trust leaders in business, and even lower in how much they trust leaders in politics or leaders in the press, has got lower and lower. So the more we've talked about authenticity, the less trust we've had. Yes, I'm not trying to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We all need to develop our trustworthiness. And we know that trust increases when a person does what they say and keeps to their commitments. When they walk their talk. When they demonstrate a congruence between what they say and how they're saying it. That their tonality and their words match, their body language and their words match. When they're able to act as a role model and they do what they're preaching. When they're able to be really interested in the other with empathy and with openness and curiosity. And when they're able to share their frailty and their humanity and meet people at that level. Meet people at an equality level. These are all very important and we need to hold on to. But we still need to rethink authentic leadership. We've been worrying too much about the personality, and we've still got caught into celebrityism with books about the celebrity leader, the celebrity, whether a politician, a sports player. We've got the Twitter sphere. How many followers have people got? That's still looking for the messianic and charismatic leader. And we need to worry more about not just the leader's personality, but their connection to themselves, but their connection to their ability to connect with others and to connect others with a collective purpose. So I did this research through Henley Business School where we interviewed leaders all around the world and HR directors, and we also interviewed millennial future leaders. And they told us a lot about the changing challenges. You can read more about that in the research report. But then we asked them, so what does this mean about how leadership needs to be different? And several key themes came out. And I invite you to look at this and start to think with my clients or in my organization, which of these is the biggest challenge? And perhaps put that in the chat box. So when we come to the questions and pause for that, we can pick up on your interests. But many leaders told us that actually, leadership is moving from the vertical of leading my people, my team, my function, my organization, to how do I partner across boundaries, across teams, across the organization, and across the business ecosystem. How, and I've written about this in several books, how do we move from heroic individual leaders to collective collaborative leadership, where we recognize that in today's hyper-change, hyper-complex world, if the only place of integration is the CEO, the leadership is not fit for purpose. We need teams that take collective responsibility and act as more than the sum of their parts. And I've already talked about purpose-driven and how we need to work within what Bill Sharp calls the 3 time horizons. How do we not just have a diversity in our leadership teams, but actually embrace and utilize that diversity? How, as I said earlier, does leaders need to see part of their major focus? How do I develop the capacity of all the individuals and the teams and the systems within my organization? Leader as learner and leader as developer. How do we learn to live in this goldfish bowl of social media and develop the ethical maturity to anticipate what we're doing and the consequences it may have and what may come back to bite us? And how do we realize that a lot of what we have to do now is working across boundaries? And given that concept, let me just pause and ask Margaret, are there any questions that have come in, or if you can, those online, please put in which of those you think it would be worth talking more about.
Okay, so Peter, while people are doing that, we have had a few questions. So here's one about, so how optimistic are you, Peter, when you talk about the enormous challenges? How optimistic are you that people are going to rise to them?
Well, one of my favorite quotes, Margaret, is from Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist imprisoned by Mussolini. And in his prison notebooks, he talked about how we have to go forward with optimism of the will matched with pessimism of the intellect. And I think I feel we are not at all moving at the speed the world of tomorrow needs us to. We're not, that is both as leaders, but looking at ourselves as leadership developers, we're not stepping up to the challenge. And I think it's so easy for consultants and coaches and strategists to always look at what do they need to do differently rather than what do we need to change in order to enable the leadership of tomorrow.
So what we have to change in ourselves and also ourselves as a community.
Yes, and in our craft. Because I still think, you know, in this research, a lot of what came up was 90% of what's happening in this multi-billion-dollar business of leadership development is no longer fit for purpose. It's still developing heroic individual leadership. And that's where a lot of the literature around the individual authentic leader is looking in the wrong place. It's not looking at it's looking at the congruence within the individual, which is important, but not looking at the congruence between the individual and the great variety of people they have to engage with, and their congruence with purpose.
Okay, so Peter, the questions are flooding in. You ready to take a few more?
We'll take a couple more, and then I'll try and some of them I might pick up in the second half.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a suggestion that there is a major impediment to do with the structures we have in place serving current leaders to keep the current system as it is, and also that the structure of compensation is solely towards shareholder value. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, and then there's another one that I think is very relevant now.
Well, just let me just quickly comment on that one, and that is, I'm always worried when we place the problem in something outside of ourselves rather than in a connection. So rather than talk about there is an impediment in the structure, I think we need to talk about we haven't yet found ways of shifting the structure and systemic processes in our organization that enable the new form of leadership. This is where I think Frederick Laloux's work, I think Otto Scharmer's work is very important because it's pointing to how can we start to take responsibility for shifting the structures and the systems. Okay,
can you take one more?
Yeah.
No? Okay, so request, could you expand on the connections you see between authentic leadership as you presented it, multiple self and situational leadership?
Well, I think, yes, if we go back to the days of situational leadership, that gave us one dimension of how do we need to flex our style for different situations and the maturity of the relationship. So I think their work was very good, but it gives us one dimension of that. And in the second half, I'll talk about some other dimensions that might help us think about how we create high flex leadership for a high flux world, because that was very much geared to how we do it depending on the maturity of the relationship and move from the directive to the coaching relationship, the team relationship, to the hands-on. Shall I use that as a springboard, Margaret?
Sorry, what was that?
Shall I use that as a springboard to talk about?
Yes, springboard to the next part, and then we'll come back to the remaining questions.
Great. So the first thing I think we need to do in rethinking the paradigm of leadership is to realize that leadership does not reside in leaders. That for leadership to happen, at least three things needs to be present. You need a leader, followers, and more has been written about the leader-follower connection across the bottom of this triangle. But the third thing you need is a shared endeavor or a joint purpose that can only be achieved through collaboration. And I would suggest that unless all three things are present, leadership is not present. If you've got a leader with a great purpose with no followers, you don't have leadership, you have a voice crying in the wilderness. If you've got a passionate group of people with a real purpose, but nobody orchestrating it and focusing it, you have a passionate mob of fired up people, but you don't have leadership. But even more importantly, in our modern world, we often have leaders and followers and no shared purpose. And what's interesting, what you have then is you don't have leadership. What you have is celebrity stalking. You know, if you think about the Twitter sphere, where someone like the Kardashians or at the other end of the spectrum, Stephen Fry, can have millions of Twitter followers. So you've got followers and a leader, but you don't have leadership. And it's the purpose is probably the most important and active factor in creating the triangulation of leadership to happen. So if we build on that, the second thing in the paradigm shift is to recognize that, and this is something I quote from a book I did in 2005, where I said leadership is less an attitude, is more an attitude than a role. It begins when we stop blaming others or making excuses. And why I still like that quote is not just because I wrote it, it's because it becomes a constant alarm bell. You know, when people give me feedback and I start becoming defensive, a little light goes on and says, Peter, right now you have stepped out of leadership because you started to become defensive and concerned with yourself rather than the connection in which the feedback is happening. You know, not to take it personally, but to be really interested in what that's saying. And that takes a lot of discipline. Thirdly, that leadership changes the drumbeat. A lovely quote that I took from somebody I was on a platform with who used to work with Martin Luther King, and he came into the music of the civil rights movement in America. He was also a baseball coach, and he had a baseball that he was bouncing up and down on the stage, and he said, listen to that music, he says. A true leader changes the drumbeat of the organization. One of the ways they do that is by creating new stories that reframe meaning. Stories that don't just speak to us intellectually, but to our feelings and our guts, and that mobilize us. And then the fourth paradigm shift is that we recognize that leadership is collective, and that teams today are having to deal with, you know, running the aircraft in the business as though they're running an aircraft at 40,000 feet and having to rebuild the aircraft at the same time, deal with the passengers at the back of the plane, deal with the weather that's coming over the horizon, talk to ground control. This needs a collective effort, not an individual effort. They have to deal with systemic conflict. In the days where we could say to the HR person, you look after the employees' interests, and finance, you look after the investors, and marketing and sales, you look after the customer, and supply chain, you look after the partner organizations. That day is gone, because the real challenges don't lie in the individual stakeholders, but in how we connect them. So to go back to that question, Margaret, if our systems is not just, you know, that we have to look after all those stakeholders, but we have to create the join up, the win-win-win-win-win, where we get the synergies between the different systemic needs within our system. And that final one, you know, a CEO who said to me, Peter, I've got lots of coaches who coach my people, lots of consultants who consult the parts, but that's not where my challenges lie. All the challenges lie in the interconnections, not just between people, not just between teams, but between our organization and all its stakeholders and between our stakeholders. And we need to learn to help develop and educate connections, not just individuals. And to do that, many of you know in my books, I've written a lot about the 5 C's model of high-performing teams and highly effective teams. About teams being clear about the why, the what, the how, the who they serve, and also how do we help teams grow their collective capacity to meet the growing depth of challenge and complexity of challenge that all teams are facing. And how do we help team managers not only become team leaders who can change the drumbeat of the story, but become team orchestrators and team coaches who can develop and grow the collective capacity of their team to step up and be more than the sum of their parts. And how do we have leaders and leadership that together can orchestrate the many different aspects that an organization leads? No one individual. And this is the problem about the authentic leader, who had to be the visionary, the strategist, the cultural role model, the transformational leader, the performance leader. So these two sentences that I try and encourage every leader to use more often. We have a challenge. Not this is the problem. Not you guys need to sort this out. Not I have a problem. We have a challenge. I need all your help in discovering how to respond, how we have to respond to this challenge. That call to collective inquiry and collective action. And what I'm suggesting is that the new model needs to go from authenticity, which is very singular and not very relational, and is about being an author of your own destiny, and is caught up with a very Western over-concern with individualism, to a level of dynamic congruence. So yes, we hold on to the notion of self-congruence, what I talked about what we need to do for others to trust us, to be congruent between our words and our actions, between our melody and our harmony, between what we say and what we do. That congruence is important. But then we have to be able to flex that with every conversation. So I've just come from speaking, I'm in London today speaking at an international conference for coaches. And there I need a different part of myself and a different connection to connect to that world than talking on this webinar. And then I'm going to have an important conversation this evening with a leader. And I have to find an alignment and rapport between their world, their language, their way of being. My body language needs to be able to match and enter their world. But the danger is if I just do that, we create a kind of egocentricity made for two. And rather than just match their world, where I start to see the world through their eyes, in the third one, I have to create collective congruence, an alignment between the person and myself and the collective world that we're part of. So I could get very caught up with one question that Margaret puts to me and forget the range of people who are on the call. And how do we hold that collective in mind and part of the one-to-one conversation? So this morning I was talking a lot about how do we bring the stakeholders into the coaching room and move beyond coaching being very expensive personal development for the already highly privileged. And the fourth level, and most important, is the purposive and collaborative congruence. How do we start, for coaches who are online, every coaching conversation with not what do you want from this coaching conversation, but asking the question, what is the work that your world needs us to do together? I said earlier that a lot of the world now is working across boundaries, working with stakeholders, working with partner organizations. And we need to do a lot more about how do we grow successful partnerships. And successful partnerships, whether they're marriages, mergers, public sector alliances, teamwork, they start by asking the question, what can we do together that we cannot do apart? And what can we do together that the world of tomorrow needs? So through GP Strategies, I was working with a very large financial merger. And they wanted our help in developing the cultural merger. And I mentioned this on the last webinar. And they said, We want to create a culture which is the best of both. Now, that's a good collective congruence question, but it misses out the purposive aspect of congruence. I said that's not the question we should start with. If you ask how can we have the best of both, we will spend 2 years arguing about who has the best IT, who has the best investment products, who has the best HR, who has the best reward systems. Rather, we have to ask another question. What is it that together we can give birth to that the financial world of tomorrow needs and that neither of us could have done by ourselves? And in my blog that I wrote, which was called Partnerships Are Not Created by Partners, I argue it's the purpose that creates the partnership, not the partners. So every conversation, whether it's a team conversation, a merger conversation, a coaching conversation, or indeed a marriage conversation, needs to start by saying, who is it that our team serves? Who is it that our marriage serves? Who is it in the future that this merger serves? And what can we do together through collaboration that we cannot do apart in service of that joint purpose and joint stakeholders? And this means that somewhere then, these aren't 4 separate congruences, but something we have to bring into alignment. And I often use the kind of the metaphor of the gyroscope, because it helps me anchor this notion of congruence in every situation I find myself in. Whereas I have to first of all think about my vertical alignment of how am I aligning my head, my heart, my gut, my hands, my feet, my connection with the earth. How am I in alignment? Then I have to think the horizontal. How am I joining the other and creating a joint connection between their world and my world? But then I have to think about the circular horizontal world, about the setting we are in, about the team, about the context, about the wider group. And then I have to think about the overarching and underarching purpose. What is it we are here to do? To be able to start each team meeting by saying, what is the work we need to do that we can only do through collaboration together before we leave this meeting, in service of the people that our team serves? What is it our stakeholders and the future need us to focus on in today's meeting? And that isn't about being true to ourselves. That's about being true to what life and our time and the future are calling us to do together, in collaboration, congruently, individually, interpersonally, collectively, and purposefully. And before we come back to the questions, this has enormous implications for how do we do leadership development. And in the research report, we also went and looked at where do we see the green shoots of development that's training collective leadership in this more relational, systemic, and ecological way. And these are some of those that we have found. First of all, basing leadership development not on theory, but challenge-based learning. So that we actually start with asking what are the 5 or 6 challenges coming over the horizon that we don't know yet how to respond to. Like the one you gave me earlier, Margaret, about we don't know how to get our reward system to reward people creating value for all of our stakeholders, including the communities where we operate and the more than human ecology. as a stakeholder. We might not even know how to measure the value of the outcomes we create for our customers, investors, employees, partner organizations, communities, ecology, for the future. In which case, why don't we develop leadership development around those leading edge inquiries, not just to come up with new thinking, but to get the leaders of tomorrow working on the challenges of tomorrow, and not only coming up with proposals, but making them happen. So future-based, challenge-based learning, deep immersion challenges by taking leadership groups and taking them into a very different culture. We've taken at Henley people into the townships in South Africa from Europe, and given them a real challenge where it's not they have to fix something for a township, but they have to work with the township and the local community groups to make change happen in real time within a week, partnering across boundaries, across politicians, local mothers, the children. How do we engage multiple stakeholders in real-time change? A lot of the work I've been doing and training people around the world in systemic team coaching of intact teams. So rather than taking individuals to leadership development, taking leadership development to the kitchen of real-time team learning, not just on away days, but in real team meetings, dealing with real team issues. We've done a lot of work also in developing not only coaching leadership teams, but coaching shadow leadership teams of diverse millennials, and then coaching the relationship between the future leadership team and the current leadership team in order that they start to shift each other's mindsets. So we're starting to get the dialogue between the stakeholders. And then I think there's also, how do we bring the stakeholders' voice into every coaching conversation and every leadership development event? So this morning at the talk I gave it with Eve Turner, a colleague, and she used to be a leader in the BBC, and at that time I was also coaching the senior team there. And she talked about what an amazing moment it was when Greg Dyke was the head of the BBC, and he got the top 120 leaders together, and they mixed them all up, so there were people they didn't know, and there was an empty chair at every table. And after a welcome and everything, he said, now we're going to bring in the most important people in our organization. Because they were all wondering who was going to sit in those empty chairs. And it was different stakeholders coming in, license fee payers and viewers of BBC programs. And they joined every table, and they joined the development event of the leadership. How do we get the stakeholders' voice into the room and into every conversation? And so the slides will be available. There's some reading lists there about different references. And as I said earlier, if you send an email in, we will make also available the paper on Beyond Authentic Leadership and the research on tomorrow's leadership and the necessary revolution in today's leadership development. And hopefully in this talk, what I've managed to help do is to look at, starting off by looking at purpose, then at culture change. What's the culture change to deliver that purpose? What's the learning processes to create the culture change to deliver the strategy to fulfill the purpose? We've come right the full cycle to what is it we can do, both as leaders and as coaches of leaders and developers of leaders. And many of us, like myself, are all three. I still chair a number of small businesses. Now, I think it's important that all of us in the leadership development are also practicing leadership, not just teaching it or researching it. How, as leaders, developers of leaders, coaches of leadership teams, we can all grow our own capacity to be in service of that wider purpose and congruent across a much wider diversity of situations. So Margaret, having set out the foundations, let's see what the engagement we need to have live with the people who are online.
Okay, so plenty more questions. There was a very early question, actually, which you might want to start with, which is somebody was asking about what's the future of coaching in this context. Anything particular you'd like to add on coaching specifically?
Absolutely, because I've just been talking about it this morning, and I've just finished a new book, so I'll put a quick plug in. It'll be out next January from Routledge, called Systemic Coaching, Delivering Value Beyond the Individual. And I use that story from where that sense of, how do we stop coaching becoming expensive personal development? We're already highly privileged. So instead of starting off by asking coaches, what do you want from coaching? I always start by saying, please tell me about you. Please tell me about, what are you most passionate about and what do you most care about in your life? And just to really plug into the heart and the meaning level. And then I say, who does your work serve? And then I'll ask, if those people were in the room right now, what would they be saying is the work you and I need to do together? So this is a total paradigm shift, because it's not me coaching them or even just working on their agenda. It's the two of us working with the agenda that life is setting. So coaching becomes triangulated, co-created, like leadership. It's the coachee, the coach, the dialogue partners in service of the person's world and the agenda that is setting, both now and from the future. I hope that at least gives some idea. So we write all about how to do that in this book, and I'm doing several workshops around that currently, if people email me.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So another one about what do you mean by serve, and how does this relate to the servant leadership model?
It relates very much to the servant leadership. It takes it into a more systemic context. So when I work with the leadership team, I will often start by having around the wall all sorts of flip charts with different stakeholders' names on, like this work, developing the leadership team, will be a success for our customers if, for our partner organizations if, for our investors if, for our employees if. And I'll always now bring in, and it will be successful for our grandchildren, our collective grandchildren, and the ecology if. Because I think it's really important that the ecology, if you like, is a critical stakeholder in every single business. Somebody once said, we have to recognize that every organization is a wholly owned subsidiary of the. I'll just say a little bit about the history of authentic, and that ecology can shut any one of us down. We're getting, I think, some noise, Margaret, from your microphone.
Okay, I will go on mute in a moment. One other question: what do you recommend for real leader development?
Well, first of all, I think we have to stop using the word leader development and talk about real leadership development, because even if it's the development of ourselves, all our development is relational. I actually radically now say there's no such thing as personal development, because there's no such thing as a person who is not engaged in a relational world. Yes? So all our development happens between ourselves and our emergent ecosystem. So if you like, we have to address the development to that relational space, the connection between the individual and their team and the rest of the organization and its stakeholders. We have to, even if we're only working with one person, there's not just two people in the room. because that one person brings their organizational culture, their team dynamic, their family processes into the room. We are always working with leadership and relational worlds, not individuals. So, this may sound very radical to some people, but there is no such thing as personal development. And that's the mindset shift we need, Margaret. So thank you for the question, whoever asked it.
Okay, and I think there's another one here that I think will be an interesting one for you, Peter. Are there any corporate or political leaders in addition to Greta Thunberg that you find resonating with the future fit?
Well, I think that I quoted her because I think her background is so unusual to think about somebody who could become a global leader from being a young girl with a form of autism. I really use that to say any of us can step into leadership. I often say leadership is not a role. It's not something you get appointed to. It's something you step into, because there's leadership at all levels. But I would also point to some of the work that, if we look in the organizational world, that if you go on to the B Corps, people like Paul Polman, Richard Branson, many people who have joined that, who are looking at beyond business as usual, and who have started to recognize that unless we focus on delivering value to all our stakeholders, including the ecology, we do not have a long-term sustainable business. So I think there are people doing extraordinary work, because what they're doing is they are attending to not how do I become a leader, but what is the leadership that the world of tomorrow is requiring that I can uniquely respond to in my context, in my world. So I think it's the purpose that creates the leadership once again. So I hope that gives some range. I think that the current Pope is doing an extraordinary job in trying to orchestrate collaborative responses to some of the major world's challenges. I got indirectly involved with some of the work that they are doing, working with the mining industry through the Vatican, to change the whole way in which the mining industry is not destroying of communities and exploitative of the environment, which I think is extraordinary. So, Margaret, are there some different, in the last 5 minutes we've got, any other different areas that people have raised?
I think we're coming to about the end of the questions, actually. Unless anybody would like to post a last one now. There is a book recommendation. Somebody has recommended Martin Hagland's This Life, Secular Faith and Spiritual Freedom, and says thank you for your work. There's also been a lot of queries about your email address, which isn't actually on this slide pack, but it's been posted in the chat, peter.hawkins@renewalassociates.co.uk. So please, yes, do take Peter up on those offers to email him directly.
And I think one of the things that I would say in closing is the one thing we can be confident about, and often I use a picture of my grandchildren to say, the one thing I can absolutely know about the future is that they will face far more complex and bigger challenges than my incredibly privileged generation has had to face. And I think the call for all of us is not how do we work better with just the current leaders, but how do we play a bigger role in developing the leadership that is being required for the next generation? And how do we step into that space wherever we're located? Because I think each one of us could probably step up several gears if we start to think about not what's the work I'll get paid for, but what is and of high moral character is requiring me to do today. And how do I do that in a way that's congruent with myself, the people I'm immediately engaged with, their wider world, and the purpose that is calling out for response?
Okay, thank you, Peter. I don't think we've got any more questions coming in, and I think we are nearly getting to the time allowed for this session. So I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping.
Higher capacity.
You've got any other final words, Peter?
No, just to say thank you for joining today, and please, whatever you've learned today, do find at least 3 other people you can share that with in a way that has impact on them and their worlds.
So thank you again, Peter. Thanks to everybody who attended for your time, attention, contribution. Again, I would like to remind you all that the recording and slides from today will be sent to the email addresses you gave us when you registered. That should come through within about 24 hours. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and thank you, Peter.
Thank you, and go well.